Hello and welcome to week 15 of SES 1120. This week we are going to finish off chapter 29, looking at food preservation methods and specifically honing in on freezing and canning. The outline of this chapter is basic. We'll start with freezing and finish with canning. There is no outline slide, so just to follow along, know that this begins with freezing and ends with canning. For freezing, we will look at the effect that freezing has on bacteria and on enzymes, which both affect food spoilage. For canning, we will look at the conditions controlled through the canning process that prevent food spoilage. And for both of these topics, we will also be discussing guidelines covering the freezing and canning storage processes. In this chapter, be able to identify the steps of the canning process. Canning and freezing both prevent food spoilage. Know the specific mechanisms for how canning and freezing keep foods safe. And finally, be able to identify the ideal conditions for freezing and for storing foods. When we freeze foods, we do two main things. We control temperature and we also control enzymatic reaction. For bacteria to thrive, they need a set of 6 specific conditions. So they need to have a food, there needs to be a certain degree of acidity, they need to be exposed at the correct temperatures for a specific amount of time. They also require oxygen and some degree of moisture or water. For freezing, we are controlling temperature to prevent microbial growth. And we'll talk a little bit more about what freezing does in future slides, but we're specifically honing in on temperature. The other microscopic living unit that we mentioned, enzymes, is also affected by the freezing process. Enzymes allow chemical reactions to occur in our body. They're present in both the plants and the animals that we eat. When an animal dies or when we remove a plant from its life source, enzymes are still going to act, but they do so without the life source or without the animal being alive. Now this allows chemical reactions to occur, which in this case will lead to a very rapid decay of the animal or plant product, overall causing a quicker spoilage rate. Moderate temperatures allow rapid growth of bacteria and rapid enzymatic reactions to occur. Heating has a similar effect on bacteria and enzymes. So heating bacteria and enzymes to high temperatures will destroy them. But this chapter focuses on the opposite end of the spectrum, on freezing. And freezing is going to have more of a neutralizing effect. So at lower temperatures, enzymatic reactions occur at a slower rate, and when we freeze foods, enzymatic reactions come to a complete stop. Cold temperatures slow things down. Think about what happens when you put a glass of water in the freezer. After a little bit of time, you start to see that water form more of a solid mass. So when you go to move that water around, it's not going to move around quite as well as it did before. You leave the water in the freezer for a much longer period of time, and within a certain period of time, that water becomes frozen solid and becomes ice. This is a solid object that does not move at all compared to the liquid object, which moves very easily and adapts to new shapes very, very easily. So when we cool foods, the same thing is going on. Reactions are slowing down, and then when we freeze foods, they're coming to a complete stop. So for foods, when we cool foods, enzymatic activity and bacterial growth slow down. For freezing, we take cooling one step further. Foods are frozen solid, and bacteria and enzymes become completely inactive. And this is going to increase the shelf life considerably, even from keeping foods refrigerated to frozen. Just that step increases the shelf life quite a bit. At room temperature, the shelf life of most foods is generally a couple days. If refrigerated, foods generally last a few days to 2 weeks. But if frozen, this increases the shelf life of food to months, if not an entire year. Foods must be stored at 0 degrees Fahrenheit or lower to deactivate the enzymes and microbes in the food. If the temperature is higher but below 32 degrees, food spoilage will still be very slow, but this means that the storage unit is less effective at keeping foods safe. A lot of freezers are going to have a thermometer built into the freezer, and if they do not, it's a great idea to go ahead and put a thermometer in the freezer to read the temperature of that freezer. A good way to tell whether or not that thermometer is working effectively is by taking a pot of water, boiling it, and then putting the thermometer into the boiling water. Boiling water in general cannot exceed 212 degrees. At 212 degrees exactly, it's going to start evaporating. So if you put the thermometer into water that is boiling and the reading is anything other than 212 degrees, this thermometer needs to be adjusted so that it says 212 degrees when it's in that water. Do not freeze eggs with shells or canned foods, but do note that canned foods can be frozen once they are removed from the can. Moisture is lost during the cooking process, and a higher moisture content helps to preserve the freshness of foods when frozen. So raw meats can be stored for longer periods of time than meats that have been previously cooked. Store foods in the freezer in a strong wrapping, such as a freezer bag. You can also use many layers of some type of plastic wrapping. This is going to ensure that the quality of the food will be preserved for the longest possible time, and you are more likely to avoid freezer burn. As long as foods are frozen, they are not going to become contaminated. However, their quality will be affected, and the longer that a food is frozen, the less desirable its flavor and texture become once that food is thawed. Also, foods that are frozen for long periods of time, even if they are frozen in very thick bags, are much more susceptible to freezer burn. Foods can typically be frozen and retain freshness from between 1 month to 1 year. However, different foods have different recommended freezer storage times, so be sure to research this before freezing foods. If you look online, if you Google FDA freezer guidelines, you will be able to find a link that shows the amount of times that certain foods should be frozen to retain an optimal level of freshness. For canning, there are two main elements of fat, TOM, food acidity, time, temperature, oxygen, moisture, that are affected by the canning process, and these are oxygen and temperature. When canning, we seal off a food so that it does not have any access to oxygen, and this prevents bacterial growth. And then we also destroy the bacteria before storing a food by heating that food to higher temperatures. In the canning process, foods are heated to high temperatures to kill most or all of the bacteria in the food. This creates an environment with low levels of bacteria. Without oxygen, it takes a very long time for these low levels of bacteria to reach unsafe or contaminated levels. Now, there are two main ways to perform this: pasteurization and sterilization. When a food is pasteurized, most of its bacteria is killed, but when it is sterilized, it is heated to a much higher temperature that is going to kill all bacteria. A potential concern for heating food is that heat also destroys essential nutrients and can have an adverse effect on food quality. For this reason, most foods are pasteurized instead of sterilized prior to canning. The shelf life of canned foods that are sterilized will be longer, but the shelf life of pasteurized foods is still increased significantly from its original unheated shelf life, and the quality of pasteurized foods compared to sterilized foods will be much, much higher for the pasteurized ones. Remember that acidity is another a requirement for bacteria to live and grow. Canned acidic foods such as tomato and pasta sauce typically can be stored for longer amounts of time in cans because their high acidic levels are not conducive to microbial growth. On a commercial level, there is more heavy-duty machinery that is required to can foods, but this slide outlines the most basic tools required for canning. First and foremost, you need a container. This container can be glass or aluminum. Aluminum is more effective at storing foods for longer periods of time, but if you are storing food on your own at home, it may be more practical to use a glass jar. Next, you need a pot. Ideally, this will be large enough to hold the container that you are storing food with and have a little extra room to account for the boiling water. And finally, fresh foods are key to effective canning. The fresher the food, the higher quality the food will have when its can is open and when it is time to eat the food. Jar lifters could be useful as well. These are tools that allow you to pick up the jars from the boiling water so that you do not have to put your hand into the water. Canning is a relatively simple process that only involves a few basic steps. When canning is done on a larger scale, such as through commercial canning, which is the canning of foods by companies, this process may be a bit more complicated, but it still involves the same principles. The following steps can be easily performed at home. So you start by sterilizing the can, killing all the bacteria on the can so that the bacteria cannot grow on the food container. You put the food into the container, then seal the container to prevent its exposure to oxygen. With the sealed container, that is placed into boiling water, and that heat is going to kill the bacteria. Once that's done, you can remove the can, allow it to cool, and then it can be stored. As long as a canned food is not dented, shows no signs of swelling, and there is no rust, the food is likely good to eat. There have been canned foods found over 100 years old that are still considered safe to eat. Will the quality of the food be affected by storing foods for an excessive amount of time? Of course, but the foods will still remain safe unless there's some type of loss of integrity to the can. So this shows the power of canning. You can safely eat foods that are maybe up to 100 years old. Not recommended, but if necessary, it may be able to happen. Generally, canned foods are safe to eat between 18 months and 5 years of their canning date. If acidic, their shelf life is generally longer because bacteria do not typically thrive in high acid environments. Denting and rust both indicate that the integrity of the can has been compromised. Both denting and rusting expose food to chemical reactions that increase their likelihood of spoilage and make them unsafe. Also note that foods should be stored in cool and dry environments to maximize shelf life and prevent microbial contamination from occurring. That's all for chapter 29, and for the rest of your slides for this class, please keep an eye on D2L for your upcoming study guide. We do have one more exam, and you do have your assignment due this Friday on D2L. If you have any questions, please send me an email or get a hold of me through D2L, and have a great week.